Hello everybody, James here. So, I'm sure as a lot of you know, Bret Hart has been making headlines over the past 24 hours or so because he was on like a podcast / live show from the Johnny One Pro YouTube channel, or Johnny I, either way. But also, I was thinking, well, because there are so many, headlines and bits of news being made off quite a lot of these quotes, I wanted to get to the nub of the fact of, what's real, what's not, and, if anything had been lost in translation as far as him making a joke or, dark humor or anything like that. So, here is a full recap of his 1 hour 30 almost show that he did. Now, I can't promise this will be too much shorter, but I'm going to do my absolute best, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit to, even in a couple of cases, argue some of Bret Hart's points as well. So, let's get to the exact nub of the matter, and let's go straight from the beginning. So, originally, Bret discusses having a part in conceiving Vince McMahon signing Steve Austin, and he asked Vince McMahon, why would he let ECW sign Steve after he was fired from WCW when the WWF were absolutely desperate for talent and they still had Doink the Clown in the company? Now, I can't remember when Doink was gotten rid of eventually, but I know it was 95, so it was close, if not overlapping slightly between the ECW signing of Austin and Doink still wrestling for the company. But anyway, Bret then talks about how he thought the I Quit match was going to suck because Steve Austin and he aren't really submission wrestlers. I mean, they kind of are, but also, I mean, Steve really wasn't, I guess. I mean, Bret definitely was, I suppose. But also, you're taking away one of the big stories in trying to get a pin. And that's why Bret thought it was going to be a terrible match, but then basically, you know the story, they pulled it off. He also said that with both Austin and Piper, when they did the face-offs at the beginning of the ring, he was biting the inside of his cheeks to stop himself from laughing. Now, Austin said that he'd never bladed before, and Bret convinced him to let him do it instead. This is a kind of a cardinal sin, really, almost, to one, offer this, and two, accept it, but if you remember back in the time, the I Quit match was 97, the mass transit incident happened like 6 months beforehand, and that all, I was going to say started, but I mean, it's all New Jack's fault, obviously. Ultimately, I guess, as annoying as I guess the mass transit kid was, but or perceived to be at that time, but, he asked New Jack to get him some colour, and that kind of precipitated an awful lot of problems that went legal and everything else that happened, but this isn't a video about mass transit. Anyway, Bret does it, works out really well. Then he starts talking about Ric Flair's nut shots. Now, he says he's doing the actions and everything, and I'm going to do them for you as well. He says that kind of, up yours kind of motion of a nut shot is really crappy, and he says it never really hurts, which is basically why people do it with their arms or legs, I guess. But he said that the way they did it in Stampede is that basically you spread your legs and then they kick you with the shin into what basically looks like your balls, but it's not. You sort of extend your toes out and you kick them up the arse instead, so it looks great, doesn't really hurt, and then you go over. And he said he discovered this while at a Rod Stewart concert, and some apparently huge girl who he described as about 6'5" started trying to attack him for whatever reason, and that she kicked him, or was intending to kick him in the balls, but then accidentally did the same thing and basically missed his balls and kicked him up the arse instead from the front somehow. And from that, I think Bret says that he kind of just carried on with that in Stampede, and so did everybody else. He also said he got into a fight with this random woman, and Rod Stewart saw the whole thing. Now, he talks about getting along with Owen. He says Owen... I am going to start editorializing in a second, so I'm not just recapping. He said Owen was great as a wrestler off the bat, wanted to get Owen involved in the WWF as early as 84, 85, but he had no clout at the time backstage, so he couldn't really ask. He said when he eventually got some matches for Owen, and Owen actually did have quite a few matches in 86, none of them televised, but... he said that he did get Owen a tryout as well in 86 that didn't go anywhere. Now, the reason it didn't go anywhere, and this is part of me adding to stuff, is that the same Superstars taping, and you won't find this because Bret actually writes about this in his book, but I can't find this in match listings because it was a dark match and I guess nobody was really paying attention, and also listings from the 80s and, well, all decades, but, the older they get, the harder it is to get good listings. But the same Superstars taping, I think it was Superstars Not Wrestling Challenge, either way, whenever it was, that Owen Hart got somewhat of an official tryout because he'd done a few matches beforehand. Some as Owen Hart, some as Owen James, which is James is his middle name, so they didn't clash with Bret Hart. He said that despite appearing several times at house shows, it was the same taping that Bret Hart wrestled Tom McGee. And if you remember that whole story, Vince McMahon was, creaming himself so hard over Tom McGee that basically Owen Hart's tryout got completely overlooked and he never got a callback, or didn't get a callback for a couple of years. And apparently, to make things worse, the guy who Owen was working with, just described as some jobber, said he didn't support him properly on any of his high-flying moves, and he ends up falling down and looking like crap in the process. So that's why Owen Hart, he was being looked at in 86, but never really went anywhere until 88, I think it was, when he became the Blue Blazer. Then he didn't really go anywhere at that point either, at that point. I said at that point twice, but you know what I'm saying. Bret talks about how he wasn't a tough guy like his father Stu, and he also had no intentions to fight for real to make a living. Bret also declared that Roddy Piper, and this is interesting, was the opponent who brought out the best in him. And Bret also says that he himself personally takes credit for most of his greatest matches with Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels and whatnot, because basically, as he remembers it, he was giving about 90% of the ideas to the match, while the other guys, who were both, younger and therefore subordinate to him, I guess, pretty much listened and followed his directions. But he said that with Roddy, Piper had more tenure in the business. He was a legend even at that time in 92. And he was the one who laid out as much of, if not more, of the match. And Bret actually says that he was really relieved that he and Roddy were completely on the same page as far as telling the story of said match. Not so much the moves, because the moves come later. The story and the point of the match comes first. Piper also apparently said to Bret that, it could turn out into a shoot out there. You never know when I'm going to shoot on you, just to wind him up, basically. And Piper had also wrestled Bret in enough hotel rooms for real over the years that Bret took that quasi-seriously, if nothing else. Then he actually thought that when he lost the IC title, this is the beginning of 92, to the Mountie, just for the Mountie to lose it to Piper, he thought he was being swerved or double-crossed by the Office, until Piper said that he was actually dropping the belt back to Hart. It just goes to tell you just how little the wrestlers knew of their direction going forward at this point, and probably still to this day for a certain point. I mean, I've interviewed enough people who said, I didn't know I was getting the IC belt or anything else until the day of the show. So anyway, he says that Roddy Piper passed the torch and that he knew how to make somebody a hero and drag that person up to his level. And then Bret says he was the converse to Hulk Hogan and Jake Roberts, who never passed the torch to anybody. Here's a quote: "All they did is take and take and take and never help anybody. Two of the biggest pieces of shit in the wrestling business." Well, the Hulk Hogan thing didn't pass me by, but the Jake Roberts issue did. Back in 93, we're talking Hogan again. Bret felt Hogan had the chance to pass the torch to him and legitimize him as the heir apparent to Hogan. Hogan was very selfish in that respect, so Bret felt, and I think a lot of people would feel, ends up getting the belt back on himself, takes the shine off everybody else, and then then Hogan ends up losing to Yokozuna in the most screwy finish in the entire world. And then he buries the company later that year in an interview in Japan, I think, where he said that the WWF title was easy to win and it meant nothing to him. It was the IWGP title that was the real prize. But anyway, the thing with Jake and Bret, Jake once claimed that Bret and Shawn Michaels were the two worst champions there ever were. Now, I think this is many years ago. There's been far worse champions, of course, in that time. I mean, even at the time, even if this was back in 2000, that's a really astonishing claim, because it's complete bollocks, really, if you think about it in any way. I mean, if you're going to go on drawing power of the worst champions of all time, I mean, there's many transitional champions as well. If we're going to, have it down to just the WWF, I mean, during that time period in the mid-90s, Diesel was the lowest drawing champion. So you can't go on drawing power. And if you're going to go on match quality, I mean, who can you get more than Bret and Shawn to give you the most high-quality matches of two of the, most important and celebrated and greatest pro wrestlers who ever lived? So I don't know what Jake was smoking at that time. Well, I didn't quite mean it like that. So, do you ever keep getting these random calls constantly from mobile numbers, and then it's just like a pre-recorded thing? I keep getting bothered. Anyway, Bret would respond to this, saying that he knew he wasn't as big a draw as Hulk Hogan, but who was, and then he added, quote, "I think it bothers me that someone like Jake, who never went to the gym, if he did go to the gym, he might do a set and then go smoke a cigarette outside. He was not a tough guy, was not a legit athlete, he was strictly a promo, and he was a great worker, a great pretend wrestler." But Jake Roberts said something like, "We were too small, and we never drew big numbers or anything like that." But I say in response to that, where was Jake Roberts? Hart asked, why didn't Roberts take the torch? Why wasn't he there? Well, here's the thing. Now, I'm going to actually defend Jake here a bit as well. Is the mid-90s was a terrible time for pro wrestling in general. It wasn't Bret's fault, Shawn's fault, or Diesel's fault individually for a depression in the business. It just, Hogan was going away, a bunch of scandals, people just kind of over the wrestling boom, and the wrestling business does prove itself cyclical, if I can say that, over the decades, even though it doesn't necessarily have to be that way if, booking was optimal, but when is it ever? So, here's the thing though, Jake left the WWF in 1992. In fact, he actually quit in 1992 because originally he wanted to start retiring and getting out of the ring, and he wanted Pat Patterson's job. He was at the time the head booker of the WWF, and then he was forced to resign over the Ring Boy scandal accusations, and then Vince told Jake, for whatever reason, that he wasn't going to get the gig of the head booker that Jake had been pining for, basically. And I think Vince just said, out of respect for Pat, we're going to keep the position open, I guess. And Jake wasn't going to get it. So Jake quit after WrestleMania 8 in 1992, which was the same show as the Bret Hart versus Roddy Piper match. He went to WCW shortly thereafter, but then he was gone quickly. And also by, 92, 93, he was a total unreliable mess. And his career pretty much, I mean, as legendary as his career is, after 92... He just sort of, for the most part, faded into obscurity as almost a what could have been. So he didn't really have the opportunity, I guess, to pass the torch. I don't know whether he would have or wouldn't have done. But once again, I think Jake's initial criticism of Bret is completely ridiculous. Maybe Bret's criticism of Jake is also a bit unfair as well. Now, Bret names Kurt Angle as a wrestler he would have loved to have faced, and then the audience starts shouting out names. Lance Storm gets a, yeah, why not? Bret responds to Dean Malenko's name and saying, nah, let's leave Dean Malenko at home, which I was really surprised. I thought Bret would be all over Dean as an opponent. People then start saying El Dandy, but Bret doesn't bite on that. But he does say that Rey Mysterio is one he would have loved to have wrestled. He says he loved masked wrestlers, but then says Mil Mascaras looked great, but he sucked as a wrestler and as a human. Bret then declares Rey might be the greatest wrestler of all time, and that nobody could lace his boots, and he would have loved to have wrestled him. Now, he also says that by the time he got to WCW, this is Bret we're talking about, he was maybe a bit too old to be where he needed to be to give Rey the best match that he could have done. But once again, I think this is a huge compliment coming from Bret as well, basically one of, if not the greatest of all time. Bret says that he begged Eric Bischoff to put him with people like Rey, but Eric didn't. He also said that he would have loved to have wrestled The Rock one more time when he was The Rock and not Rocky Maivia on a throwaway match on Raw, and also John Cena as well. Bret says that he thought that he and John Cena could have done some great business, especially with the US versus Canada thing, and says that Cena liked him as a true professional because he's seen Cena work out his matches in person, and he goes over every single little detail to make sure it's as good as it possibly can be. Then somebody says, what about MJF? And Bret says, who is that? And then he goes, well, you can tell I've not been watching recently. So there you go. He also says AJ Styles, Bryan Danielson, two more thumbs ups he would have liked to have wrestled with. And he also says Brock Lesnar is somebody he would have liked to have battled as well. Bret then says that he always understood that Brock Lesnar was one of... when he was asked of dream matches, that he mentioned Bret as a dream match. That's somebody he would have really liked to have worked with. And he also said that, and Bret also said that he heard that Brock Lesnar was a professional, unlike Bill Goldberg, because we've always got to say that now. Brock knows what the wrestling business is all about, whereas Bill Goldberg doesn't know anything about the business now. Now, you can always argue that Brock, just occasionally, sometimes will just do what Brock wants to do and nobody will tell him otherwise. I believe that's how he ended up winning a Royal Rumble one year. He just decided he was winning it and everybody else went, okay. and then wouldn't argue with him. Bret agrees that John Cena is a modern-day GOAT, and that reminds me just how fucking stupid GOAT is as a term. If nothing else, one, it's like a billy goat, and it just conjures up the image of a goat in your mind's eye, but also it's as overused a term as it could possibly be in any endeavour, especially in sports. And it means the greatest of all time, not just one of the greatest of all time kind of things, and everyone always uses it in the latter rather than the former. CM Punk called Bret Hart the Wayne Gretzky of wrestling, and he agrees that nobody can be called the GOAT because it depends on what you like. Now, Bret says he can't stand wrestling today. Now, this is going to be a big old piece of contention, I'm sure, with some of you at least, but I can't imagine the vast majority, really, because he says that wrestling today looks way too fake. He still loves watching wrestling from the 1990s and even old Stampede wrestling tapes because the punches and the kicks and the presentation are also so much more realistic. Now, today's wrestlers are actors pretending to be wrestlers, and they don't know how to even do a headlock properly. Everything is high spots, and wrestling needs to pretend to be wrestling, and he misses the actual wrestling and psychology of 60s and 70s professional wrestling and actually pretending it's a real sport first and foremost. And thank goodness he said that, because I couldn't agree more. Now, you can complain that this is just an old head pining for the old days. If you're such a new fan that modern wrestling from the past 5 or 10 or even 15 years is kind of all you know, or if you're Dave Meltzer and you're basically lying to yourself. Now, that's literally his argument for people not loving, and this is, I'm pretty sure of this, AEW in particular. Because, if you don't like AEW and you're complaining about the moves and all that kind of thing, and pro wrestling in general in the modern day, it's because you're stuck in the past, man. You're not moving with the times, and that's why that makes him such a great fan and journalist, and that's why your opinions don't mean dog shit, Grandad. Well, at some point, you just have to be honest with yourself and accept that wrestling in the 1990s was so much better as compared to the product of today for numerous reasons. And we'll forget about the creative reasons and how there was so much more you could quite frankly get away with at that point, which made wrestling so much better as far as storylines and promos go. But anybody who tells you that the Attitude Era or WCW in the 1990s or the 97, for example, were overrated, or is either lying or they're after a reaction, or they just weren't watching at the time. Now, and it's not just my era. I love 1980s NWA. I love World of Sport. I love Memphis Wrestling. And I see that wrestling on the whole was so much more realistic and grounded and entertaining than it is now, that it's not even funny. It's just ridiculous how much better it was in the 80s and 90s for me. That's not me being biased towards the wrestling I grew up with, though, because I grew up with wrestling from 93 onwards. I'm too young for all the territories, and also I didn't get all the territories because I'm not even in the right country for all the territories. And World of Sport wasn't a territory. That was, for people who don't know, World of Sport was not the promotion's name. It was a sporting television block, like Grandstand or anything like that. Or I'm sure an American version would be like Wild World of Sports. And that the actual promotions were, All-Star or whatever else. Now, or joint promotions, for example. Now, once again, that's not being biased. I didn't watch these things growing up. I can look back at them as an adult and realise that they're better. Now, wrestlers today in the WWE NXT system, for an example, are specifically taught to only do the moves that they've pre-agreed and practiced in advance for the most part, and to be entirely reliable on the producers talking to the referee to tell them what to do and walk them through the bouts step by step. And here's the thing, it's really obvious too what they're doing. I mean, you didn't need to watch WWE Unreal to see that they were getting all these instructions constantly and they were going through their pre-prepared match constantly. And suspending disbelief for me these days is something that went from something you could drop into quite easily to really having to force yourself to do every minute of every show. Now, the matches are a series of spots. The strikes don't look as crisp on the whole, on average, and I'm comparing 90s and 80s. The best compared to the best. And as for interviews and charisma, I mean, there is no comparison whatsoever. Name one person in wrestling today that has the charisma of Scott Hall or a prime Ric Flair or Hogan or Dusty or Piper or Eddie Guerrero or a prime Shawn Michaels maybe. Or nobody gives as good an interview as a prime heel Bret Hart does today, and I am including CM Punk and others in that list. Now, obviously, you can cherry pick whatever wrestler you like from whatever era in the past to counter-argue my point. Bob Backlund, for example. I've just never been a Bob Backlund fan. And there's lots of wrestling from decades gone by that just is way worse than what is going on today, on average. And I promise you, some of the wrestling I've seen from decades gone by, and I always say WWF, those shows, I remember when the network was still up and watching loads of the shows from like 77, 78, and they were bloody awful, most of them, apart from the promos. The work itself didn't hold up whatsoever. But once again, I'm not talking the 70s, I'm talking the mid-80s kind of onwards to the late 90s, basically, is my era as well, for the most part, of wrestling years that I enjoyed the most. But once again, when you're comparing the best of yesterday to the best of today, I feel there's no comparison, and I'm in complete agreement with Bret. The best main event stars, the best mid-card stars, the best tag teams, the best enhancement talent, even the looks of the set designs compared to something 97 to now, I still prefer the ones from 30 years ago almost. Oh, and of course, nobody kicked out of each other's finishes 14 times a match because everyone was so creatively bereft these days, and now that's what every single major match is reduced to. Now, that and stabbing each other's heads with forks as well. Now, I know that Abdullah the Butcher did that back in the day, but, you know, at least it was only one person, it was his shtick, and he travelled so much you barely saw him. Now, of course, there are still wrestlers out there who bring the 11-year-old fan out of me, but once again, there are very few, and wrestling has changed. And in my mind, and many other people's minds, for the worse, really. Now, back in the late 90s, they used to claim anyway, 40 million people combined used to watch wrestling every single week. Once again, so they claimed. I mean, it was probably bullshit, but it's probably over 10 million per year. 33 million people tuned into NBC to watch Hulk Hogan lose the WWF title to Andre the Giant. Now, 2025, times have changed. There's streaming platforms. There's YouTube with all the videos free of charge. There are so many different types of entertainment out there that wrestling is not competing against 10 things, it's now competing against 1,000 things. I get that. But my theory is that once you become like a real wrestling fan, not just a bit as a kid, then you grow out of it, you're always a wrestling fan. And you're kind of secretly always hoping for something really good to happen so you can actually get back into it and start enjoying it again. But now on television, and I'm talking WWE, AEW, compared to the 90s where they were claiming 14 million, let's just call it 10 million. But now there's maybe 2.5 million actively watching wrestling fans in the States. That's a complete guess for me, but SmackDown's now achieving 1.2 million. AEW's hovering between 5 and 600,000, not including HBO Max numbers, of course. And for the most part, I think there's quite a lot of crossover with them. There's not that many fans out there actively actively watching wrestling. But I think there's a plethora of people out there who are desperate to start watching wrestling again. And that's not because of Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or Disney or Paramount Plus out there taking away their attentions. I just think it's because wrestling isn't as good as it used to be. And once again, this is very much me getting on my high horse and not recapping what Bret had said, but I'm kind of embellishing the point, I guess. But once again, you know, I just think that Bret's completely right, and the reason he can't watch wrestling is the reason that most people who did like watching wrestling don't watch anymore. I think everybody, for the most part, can agree on what wrestling is missing these days and what they need to get back down to. I mean, get back down to basics. I mean, stop the terrible bad acting in the pre-recorded vignettes that just permeate every show. I hate them. I've hated them since WWF started doing it in '99, where they pretend the camera's not there. Like, get everyone to start working on their promos. Like, do a 1-minute promo building up the match and themselves and stuff. That's a lost art. Ditch the 40,000 high spots for every match. Do a tiny bit of non-pre-planned wrestling just to make it seem a bit more real. Work on punches and kits. I've got the word skits written down here. There's punches and kicks, and then the acting of the skits, which I sort of jumped ahead to. And also, you know, make the matches a little more realistic. But anyway, that's my little soapbox thing for pro wrestling these days. Bret Hart says that Ricky Steamboat is a great example of somebody who made wrestling look real. Now, once again, you can pull apart everybody's work and say, well, the chops didn't look that great. But but maybe the chops look great in hindsight, but I don't know. I always thought that Ricky Steamboat's chops were like that, and then just stood there for 10 seconds while they died. I mean, it was all great. It's all pro wrestling and stuff, but the great arm drags that everyone always lauds Ricky Steamboat for, which is kind of weird in a sense because it's the person taking the arm drag that deserves as much credit. But anyway, back to the recap. Bret explains how to do a headlock properly. Bret then says it's a bugbear of his that punches these days suck because instead of punching, pro wrestlers punching, they open their hand at the last second, sort of like, I'll do it slow-mo. Oh, that kind of thing. And close it again on the way out, and then he singles Sheamus out to somebody who does that, and it really annoys him, and someone needs to take out 10 minutes of their life to tell Sheamus how to throw a punch properly. This is kind of ironic at this point because Steve Austin does that, and so does The Rock as well. I mean, two of the biggest stars of all time, but, you can pull apart anybody's work. Bret talks about the punches and how they look like he was hurting opponents when he wasn't. He was kind of hurting them, though, because he kind of admits, well, it was actually hurting them a bit. Not enough to leave a bruise, though. But he said that the way he would punch his opponents, instead of obviously like that with the knuckles, is that at the last second he would twist his hand and he would punch, because he said he had meaty hands back in the day, with the soft part of the underside where the little finger is there. So he would punch and then like that, or, basically sweep through and brush past their head. And Bret always the Undertaker described Bret as throwing rubber hammer punches because they would hit the head and they would hurt a bit. But once again, he's proud that his matches look real and he never hurt anybody. I think one person has claimed that they did hurt him for real, but I can't remember who it was, whether it was Honky or Bad News Brown or whoever it is. Talks hockey for a bit, I don't care. Reflecting on the Screwjob, which is actually why they were there. Bret says he's proud of his conduct throughout it, and WWF was messing with him for the year after he re-signed with the company around October of 96, I think it was. He calls Vince McMahon a slimeball and a crook and a liar, and talks about the Screwjob and Shawn Michaels losing his smile. Now, he says that Shawn's knee injury, Bret felt, and he said this many times before, including his book, felt that it was complete nonsense when he lost his smile and he dropped the title without actually losing it to anybody. And my eyes watering now. And then he especially felt that Shawn was faking the knee injury after Shawn purposely, after dropping the title some 6 weeks later, he came in and did a backflip off the top rope and landed on his feet. And Shawn has explained why he did that as well. And his explanation is like the stupidest explanation in the world, because basically he was just giving everybody more ammunition to think that he was faking the injury. And he knew he was doing that as well, so I don't know what his problem was, but anyway. Bret felt that Vince McMahon had a tear rolling down his cheek during that segment. Now, this is where it really gets interesting. During that promo, that segment, and backstage, whatever. And he says from that, he suspected that Shawn Michaels and Vince McMahon were secretly lovers. Now, he thinks McMahon and Shawn really were sleeping with each other, because he says 4 different times, I'm not kidding, and like the audience is doing some incredulous laughter, it's like, come on, that kind of thing. But he genuinely thinks that there's something like that happened that was closer to the truth, and that is that comes up again in a minute, by the way. Now, I'm not reading all that. I genuinely thought he was saying this tongue-in-cheek when I was looking at the transcript before I'd watched the show. But he really seemed like, no, I'm pretty sure now. That's a quote, he said, and how he basically believes it to be the case. Now, as bizarre as this accusation is, he's nowhere near the first person to ever say that Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels were lovers. Now, Road Warrior Hawk, I believe, used to say that all the time. And a few years ago, I guess people would have thought that to be completely preposterous. But then Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, one of the two, or maybe both of them, told the story that Vince McMahon started recounting his first gay experience. This is back in 96, I guess, when they were both in a meeting with him. And at least he started talking about it, or at least the first part of it, and then he trailed off or caught himself and stopped telling the story. Or that he seemed, and this is, as we've realised, true with the accused with the Janelle Grant lawsuit, is that he seems to be obsessed with threesomes where the guys outnumber the girls. So I guess, anything's possible, really, in that sense. Although, in this case, I'm still not buying that. And until we have more concrete evidence or admission, I'm still going to err on the side of no, Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels were not lovers. Now, has wrestling changed for the better after the screw job? And Bret says no. Despite how much money the business is generating today, he feels like it isn't. Now, Bret says it with the screw job after he remembers looking in the mirror and wondering if he brought this all on himself, despite working nearly 15 years and then being ousted after the screw job. So constantly, Bret said he was worried about a week before the screw job that something funny was going to happen in Montreal, and that he knew that the company was out to mess with him. He appreciates Montreal as a city and the fans residing in Montreal, and he calls them, true wrestling fans. Of course, with Lute International and, a strong history of pro wrestling in the city as well. How could they not be? Now, he talks about honouring wrestling as well, back to Screwjob, and how the business works on trust. He says also that he feels that he won the title at SummerSlam, or was given the title at SummerSlam from The Undertaker in 97, because he felt that that Vince McMahon wanted to push him off the top of the mountain before he left. And he also mentions the reasonable creative control in his last 30 days with the company, but he kind of brushes past that, really. Something I want to bring up here. David Otunga, who used to be with the Nexus in WWE, and he's a real-life lawyer, or he's qualified at least, to make the point, or he was trying to make the point, that because the contract stipulated in the last 30 days reasonable creative control, but I think he said, and I've not listened to this, but I read a write-up, is that as soon as Vince McMahon told Bret that he was thinking of breaking the contract, that meant he shouldn't have had 30 days creative control. And that's kind of like me saying that I should clean the carpet now because I'm thinking of taking a shit on it later. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, and therefore nothing was breached. I mean, you can guess anything you want, I think, but there was no breach at the time. Also, how does one party breaking a contract make the other party's contract completely invalid? Because surely that's what a contract is there for. I mean, to uphold the agreements, legally speaking, in case one party contravenes it. Now, I was going to do a video on that, but I don't have time. And also, it was a week or two ago since I read that quote, so I might have got that wrong. But if that's basically what he said, it makes no sense. Bret recounts also the story of Shawn Michaels saying he wouldn't put him over after Bret Hart said that he would put Shawn over. And then he said the lack of respect and unprofessionalism, and he says that would have never happened. Montreal would have never happened if Shawn hadn't said that to him. And that is why Bret had refused to lose to Shawn, but he would lose to anybody else. He talks about the finale of the Screwjob, which I'm not going to recount all here, and punching Vince McMahon. And that's pretty much it. So, as an aside, I read that Bret may well not have tried to sue Vince McMahon for an interesting reason. Breach of contract, etc. I'm not talking about kayfabe reasons here. But it may have been because after, the bell was rung and he was left in the ring with the rest of the Hart Foundation, that he started destroying all the TV monitors and the cameras. And basically, he was causing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage. So, inadvertently, he may have given Vince McMahon a reason to countersue. And that is the reason why Bret didn't sue Vince McMahon for breach of contract in the first place. Now, plus, he's going to be making $8 million or so in WCW in the next 3 years, and I guess he wanted to keep that money instead of give it to lawyers. And I think that's pretty much where this video should end. So everybody, I know that was kind of me blathering on and recapping stuff. I think it is actually worth the watch. I've never heard of this person who's hosted it before. He doesn't have that many subs or anything, and I've not looked into him. But it's worth watching because Bret does most of the talking, of course. It's not like a regular podcast kind of thing where, the co-host talks as much as the guest. It's actually Bret just mostly talking and addressing an audience. So it's definitely worth watching and getting some of his opinions on stuff, because Bret is, for me anyway, one of my all-time favourites. I was like listening to him. So that's pretty much the video I'm doing. I'll see you again for the next one.